Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 2025 June edition of Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. I'm Araya April, your NC State Extension Master Gardener Program Assistant. We're happy today to hear from our guest speakers, Matt Bertone and Mike Munster, on pests and plant diseases associated with weather-induced stress. Matt and Mike are going to dig into how extreme weather conditions can stress plants and identifying pests and plant diseases linked to weather-induced stress. By the way, the photo you see here is one our statewide program manager, Charlotte Glenn, took just a few years ago of flooding from a Chatham County creek near her home. We've been having a lot of weather in our parts of North Carolina, especially with extreme heat, so this presentation is extra timely. We're going to have a few minutes after Matt and Mike's presentation for them to answer your questions. You are always welcome to drop your questions in the chat. Afterward, Matt and Mike will roll into our BOLOs, or the plant and pest and diseases to be on the lookout for this summer. Then we're going to hear from Charlotte, who's going to present our Plant Bees for Pollinators on coneflowers, along with program announcements that you don't want to miss. Before we get started, a friendly reminder that we're seeking your input on which statewide initiatives we might focus on. Your feedback can help us decide which tools and resources can best prepare and support Master Gardener volunteers to realize Extension's programming goals for consumer horticulture. Your input can also guide us how we invest endowment and day of giving funds over the next few years to maximize our impact. You can see the survey link here. It's also listed on the EMG intranet in the announcement banners. Thank you to those who've already submitted input. We appreciate it. I'm now going to turn it over to Matt and Mike at the NC State Plant Disease and Insect Clinic. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, Matt, so you can start.
Great, thanks, Araya. All right, well, this morning I'm going to begin talking about critters, and Mike will be joining us near the end of the session to discuss some diseases. But let me get this all loaded up. Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk about weather-induced stress, but also kind of weather in general and seasonal things, just kind of a little bit more broad topic than the title might allude to. But like I said, I'm going to talk about critters and some of these concepts and everything that Mike is going to continue with a little bit of disease at the end. And so first, I have to define weather versus climate. This is something you all probably learned in grade school, but NOAA, of course, says whereas weather refers to short-term changes in the atmosphere, climate describes what the weather is like over a long period of time in a specific area. I also should mention that climate change is real. Overall, the Earth is getting warmer. So 9 of the top 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 1998. Even though sometimes local weather doesn't always reflect, climate change and warming, it does make sense in light of how weather systems are affected by warming. And so, for instance, people say if the Earth is getting warmer, why is it so cold and snowy? That's because extreme weather events are much more common nowadays. And changes due to warming have downstream effects. So they change the weather patterns. So just because the Earth overall is getting warmer doesn't mean that it's always going to be warm everywhere all the time. But as you may have noticed lately, the extreme weather events are becoming stronger and more unpredictable, like storms and whatnot. And just to mention where we are in North Carolina, this is from Wikipedia, our climate. So I wasn't aware of these climate types, but basically most of North Carolina is in the humid subtropical climate. That's the light green on the map. But up in the mountains, we have a subtropical highland climate. And I really like these maps down here because they show other areas of the world where the similar climate exists. So, North Carolina is very similar to southeastern Brazil, northwestern or northeastern Argentina, and eastern China, which is actually where a lot of our biodiversity is very similar, and why we got probably a lot of invasive pests from there because they can exist here. So just be aware that our climate is this type of climate, and so certain plants are really also going to be more adapted to living here than others. And this is where we would get into hardiness zones and whatnot. But this is always changing. So things are getting warmer. Things are changing. So let's talk about Four Seasons, not the hotel. So here in North Carolina, we do have the benefit of having kind of fairly four distinct seasons in many areas of the world, especially the tropics. It's less so, and they often have kind of wet seasons, dry seasons. But here we have the typical spring, summer, fall, and winter. And just here's some data. Actually, I found this really cool website where you put in different cities. And for North Carolina, I had Charlotte, Wilmington, and Asheville temperatures throughout the year. Raleigh, I put in, and it's basically identical to Charlotte, so I'm not showing that. But you can see that, out in the mountains, Asheville has generally lower overall temperatures throughout the season. Charlotte has a little bit higher temperatures, and then Wilmington near the coast, down in the southeastern part of the state, are going to be a bit warmer on average than the rest of the state. So again, we're talking to a group found throughout the state. So these things vary in different regions of the state. Now, as far as arthropods go, critters, and seasonal changes, so there are very few arthropods that are active all year round. So these things like spiders and flies can be kind of exist all year round and be active, but most things kind of have a seasonality. They often have a peak time of activity, and this can be either broad or narrow. Some things are only out for about a month, whereas other things are out when it's kind of just warm during the kind of regular warm season, growing season. The seasonal cues and development are based on both temperature and daylight. So these are the things that tell organisms when to become active, when to go into more resting states, things like that. And because the weather varies year to year, we rely on degree days for estimating arthropod activity. And so this is a concept, and this actually kind of goes against the little BOLOs thing we talk about. We do try to generally give, our BOLOs, our be on the lookouts are fairly general, but year to year, these things can vary. So things can come out earlier or later, depending on how warm the lead up is. And so basically, there's a lot of calculations on how to do this, but basically you have to take the minimum tolerance that the creature or organism can stand and the upper thresholds, and then you count how many hours and days basically, and that will give you an estimate on when things should start to become more active. So when you ask, when are we going to see blank? The answer is it depends on the weather. So if we have a cooler start to the year, things will be slower to become active because they don't reach their degree days that they would normally. And really normal is relative. But they can be predictable. So overwintering insects will wake up in the spring, of course. Some are going to be adults overwintering and waiting to wake up in the spring. Some are pupae, waiting to emerge as adults. So many moths, like this Luna moth in the top left, are going to overwinter as a cocoon as a pupa, and then the moth will emerge in the spring. Some are nymphs or larvae, and so they're waiting to feed a little bit more and finish development. So a lot of white grubs, for instance, the eggs are laid in the ground. They develop over the late summer and early fall, or so in the year before, and then they continue developing through the spring and then pupate and become adults later. And then some are just eggs on surfaces or inside plants waiting to hatch in the spring. And it's difficult to make broad generalizations. So even closely related species or groups can have differences. For instance, some noctuid moths overwinter as pupae, but others will actually remain as a caterpillar through the winter on plants and can then become active very quickly in the spring. So you can't make assumptions just based on what type of organism it is or what type of arthropod. Then basically those insects that overwinter as adults need to find places to rest or hibernate over those months. And since we've kind of cut down a lot of the woods and places like that to develop, those developed areas, the homes become the places where things overwinter. And here's a brown marmorated stink bug in my home in the fall coming in. So this can also cause them to become a nuisance or quickly reinfest plants in the spring because they're adults already. They can go mate and lay eggs and feed on the plants basically as soon as it starts to get warm. And these often invade homes in the fall and then wake up in the spring, much to the homeowner's dismay. And so you'll see an influx of certain critters. I'll show you in the next slide in fall, and then they start to wake up and leave in the spring. And so these are the kind of peak times for these types of arthropods. And kind of groups that we'd see doing this typically are many of the larger true bugs like stink bugs, squash bugs, leaf-footed bugs, box elder bugs, and here represented by the brown marmorated stink bug, which is one of the most common species that does this. Many flies, cluster flies are called that because they will sometimes cluster in attics or barns over the winter. Some beetles, like ladybugs, are very common hibernating in homes over the winter. And social wasps, this is basically the norm for queens of social wasps and bees, where they mate with males in the fall, and then all the rest of the individuals from nests die off, and the queens overwinter to create a new nest in the spring. So again, these are some seasonal changes that you might see in arthropods. So let's talk about some actually more specific events. So first is extreme heat and drought. And of course, that's pretty timely right now because it is very hot this week. And of course, we're almost in July. We just hit summer. So 4 days ago, we hit summer. So congratulations, everyone, I guess. But of course, if you're outside right now, you feel the heat and understand this. So now heat, warmth affects arthropods in many different ways. This had a decent graphic, this review article, but increased temperatures affect arthropods, the effects they have on things, and pest management in many ways. So for instance, over here, insecticides may evaporate or may decay or deteriorate in the sun and heat, or you can't spray in certain ways. Increased number of generations, so higher metabolism causes the rate of increase to grow. This is also similar to what degree days are calculating, is the metabolism caused by the warmth. This is because arthropods get their internal body temperature from external environment. They are not like us. They don't create their own warmth. They're ectotherms. And also may affect the natural enemies of these pests, outbreaks of different diseases transmitted, of course, expansion in geographic range, so things starting to move more further north, and species extinctions can happen because of being pushed to the limits. Even some arthropods go into estivation. This is a really interesting word that just means a kind of a hibernation during hot and dry weather. So this does happen fairly regularly in arthropods when certain cues hit, especially for hot and dry weather. One thing to also note is that the heat island effect and pests, and we've actually have some people that have researched that here at our university that I'll get into in a second. But in natural settings, plants can regulate their physiology better. They're more adapted to that situation. But when we place and plant plants in certain environments, especially in parking lots, cities, other areas, there's increased heat from reflected radiation off of these surfaces, like this parking lot here, and there's reduced water access because of these impervious surfaces. So the water sits on there, it doesn't go into the soil, the plants don't get the benefit of that water, and the more impervious surface, the more stressed plants are. And this sycamore on campus, you can see it's got a lot of dieback twigs, and it's got these adventitious growth at the base of the plant, which is a huge sign of stress in a plant. And then this can also promote pest populations, reduce biocontrol, or both. They found that pests may be able to survive in the heat, and the biocontrol agents and predators and parasitoids are not as well adapted to the heat, and so the pests kind of start to go free range. And also this quote from the paper I'll show in the next slide. So sap feeding insect performance generally increases with plant stress. On trees in particular, drought stress increases sugar and nitrogen concentrations, which herbivores are able to exploit. So these herbivores, these sucking insects, need a lot of nitrogen and sugar. And if the plants are producing more, they're healthier and they're going to grow more. And Adam Dale, who is now a faculty member, an ornamentals entomologist down in Florida, and our own Dr. Steve Frank, here our ornamentals entomologist, did a study many years ago about looking at gloomy scale on maples in these types of environments. And they were able to show that both the size of the females and the number of embryos that they were able to create was increased with temperature. And so this is going to further push the tree to be more stressed, and it's kind of a snowball effect. So definitely, this also happens when planting new plants in poor soil in the middle of a yard in full sun. A lot of these trees require kind of forested areas or more natural areas, and in those other areas, they can become stressed very quickly and become attacked by pests much more easily. Now, if it's too dry too, things might need to find some water. So, everybody thinks that ants enter homes to find food, but I find that it seems to be more when it starts to dry out that they are looking for water. Water is much more important to them than food. Food is obviously important, but the local environment has a lot of food for them to eat. But if water is limiting, they'll often come in and find water in your home. So I seem to, I've actually have a little invasion of little black ants in my house right now. And I have a feeling it's because of the extreme heat. Even though we've had a lot of water, a lot of rain lately, the heat can move them, can cause them to move into different areas. Okay, let's talk about storms, wind, rain, and excess water or flooding. Now, our hockey team has been called the Hurricanes for nothing. Extreme storm events and flooding can be common here in North Carolina because of where we're situated. We're on the coast. We're kind of in the middle of the north and south. I'm not a meteorologist. Mike, I'm sure, can tell you all the details about why we are how we are here. But the volume of rain, the soil type, and we have many soil types in North Carolina, and the existing soil saturation all play into flood risks. This can cause more or fewer floods depending on all these variables. So for instance, clay soils in the Piedmont hold water for really long periods, while the sandier soils drain better. Now, this can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the situation, because of course plants need water, but not too much. And so we want to make sure that they have enough water, but excess water is sometimes and maybe often worse than less than droughts and less water. And also there can be direct damage to plants when wind and saturated soils cause uprooting. So you have constant rains, you have a soft soil, then a storm comes through with heavy winds, and it can actually uproot these plants because the soil is so soft now and saturated. So I just found this information about some, the average yearly precipitation in the state. And a lot of variables, but it's fairly somewhat consistent across. I will say I was surprised that both the maximum in the Highlands at 88 inches and the minimum at 40 inches in Asheville were both in the mountains. But there are probably a lot of things at play in the mountains with valleys and peaks and things like that. And again, I'm not an expert on weather, I'm not a meteorologist, obviously, but you can see most areas in North Carolina get about 45 to 55 inches of rain each year. Now, when flooding happens, there can be a lot of things that happen with arthropods. So many of these and other invertebrates. So many invertebrates require some moisture because they have a high surface area to volume ratio, which means that they things evaporate very quickly, and so they dry out very quickly. And so they do require some moisture. So they often live on the ground, underground, under rocks, on the ground, etc. So the theme here is the ground, and where it's typically moist or retains moisture. However, too much water will drown them, and this forces them to crawl out of their habitat toward drier areas. Unfortunately, homes and other human structures are their life raft to the annoyance of people. And I did have to include this picture. This picture has been floating around, pun intended, I guess, actually, online for a while. And it does look legit, although I zoomed in on it earlier and it looked a little strange, but this is before AI came out was more prevalent. So I'm going to believe this picture is true, but you can see this is a concrete post in the middle of a flooded area, and all of these invertebrates had climbed up onto this post. Again, I'm not verifying that this is a real picture, but it looks real enough to me, and I'm going to say that I would not be surprised if this happens. So, but it conveys the idea that I'm talking about. So we got flooding, and now we've got all these soil organisms. What's going to happen? So you're going to see a lot more of certain things. So, for instance, things we see often are flatworms and earthworms. So these aren't arthropods, but are worms, actually two different types of worms, but also millipedes and isopods, or roly-polies and sow bugs. Those are super common in soil and do require moisture. All these things require moisture, but in excess moisture, really flooding, this drives them out, and you often see worms on sidewalks. You see, when people tend to notice the hammerhead worms lately, it seems to be after rains when they have a huge abundance of them. Millipedes and isopods will crawl up on homes and inside homes, and then end up dying because the homes are now dry compared to their exterior environment, their typical environment. So again, they require moisture and water, but too much is going to drive them out of where their habitats are. Of course, mosquitoes. All mosquitoes develop in water, mostly standing water. So because of when there's a lot of rain and puddles, tree holes, and artificial containers fill up with water, this provides breeding sites for mosquitoes, and so they do become, of course, more abundant after rains. And emptying these containers can greatly reduce mosquito numbers. So after heavy rains, it's really good to go out, maybe get your neighbors to go out and empty those containers. For bird bats, they can be treated with certain things like hormone and pesticides that are safe. But just keep an eye out. Empty containers, especially if you start to see them developing, that can be a little trap for them. But if you're too late in emptying them, then those mosquitoes will emerge and begin biting in the area. All right. I don't know if anybody has seen Creep Show. I was just telling Mike about the other day. There was this story called The Raft, where some kids were stuck on a platform out in the middle of a lake, and this gross monster floating on the water was attacking them. I loved it when I was younger, but I was reminded of this because of this raft. And I'm not sure if you know what that is, but it is pretty horrifying as well. And this is actually a raft of fire ants. So fire ants evolved in South America, in the plains of South America, where there is flooding, and so they evolved a way. And there's lots of great videos online to watch if you want to explore it. They evolved a way to cluster together, and even the larvae help as for buoyancy, and they float on the floods, sometimes for days or weeks, until the floods recede, and they then colonize the soil where they land. So I have never experienced these myself. I would not wade through water near them necessarily because they might hitch a ride on you. But I think it's just an amazing phenomenon, and obviously something to look out for when floods happen. Yellow jackets, also, this was not something I was expecting, but a result of Hurricane Helene was that there was an abundance of yellow jackets out in the western part of the state. And technically, they were not more abundant, but what happened was, and the common thought is that the floods, the waters, since yellow jackets are wasps that make their paper nests underground, the flooding displaced these insects. So either drove them out of their nests, or specimen or individuals that were out hunting for prey or whatnot were not able to get back to their nests now. And so they were flying around. Apparently, they were a sting hazard, and they just had nowhere to go. And their colonies might have been destroyed, or probably were destroyed after being submerged for a long period of time. And finally, one of the strangest things that I've been getting a lot of calls about this year. In fact, I've gotten more calls and emails about this phenomenon this year than I have all of the years combined, are ropes of maggots. And that's just a fun term for columns of larval darkwing fungus gnats. And so these It's probably a weather-related thing. These are larvae of flies that require moisture to survive. They dry out very easily. And the thought is that they band together to keep moist, and they move together like a large snake to get to sites, either away from sites that they don't prefer or towards sites that they do prefer, to then disperse and pupate and become these flies that you see up here on the left. It is freaky when people see them. They can get very long. They even sometimes chase their own tail in circles. And I wrote a blog post about it several years ago, and there's lots of videos online of these as well if you don't want me to share later. But don't freak out. The flies are harmless. They're going to disperse. But people, when they see this, are amazed and disgusted. And I'm amazed, less disgusted, but I'm also jealous because I've not seen this in person yet. So, but you may have seen those, and I've gotten several calls from Wake County already and other areas, North Carolina, this year from them about them. Okay, one final thing about flooding is that, like I said, flooding can be as bad or worse for plants than drought. And that's because they respire through their roots. And so flooding can cause plant stress and death because it suffocates them. And there have been many studies that have shown that flooding plants make them very conducive to attacks by ambrosia beetles. These are very small beetles that bore straight into the wood. They produce these frass toothpicks, or these kind of sawdust kind of spikes coming out of the plant. That's what people mostly notice. Of course, if there's storming or there's a lot of rain, these will wash off. But when people notice these, what's happening is the beetle's boring straight into the wood, and it's seeding the tunnels with fungal spores to grow fungus in which it'll feed on. So they don't actually feed on the plant itself. They are using plants that are stressed or dying to grow their gardens in. Now, what happens is these plants get flooded. They don't look unhealthy, but they start sending out chemicals like ethanol and other kinds of chemicals that these beetles home in on. They're very tiny. They start attacking the plant, and people think that the ambrosia beetles are killing the plant. Remember, unless you know it's a primary pest species like red bay ambrosia beetle and bay laurels or sassafras, things like that, where we know that it's a species that primarily attacks healthy plants, ambrosia beetles are a symptom, not the cause of the plant's problems. In this case, flooding was the cause of the stress and the plant's problems. And the beetles just homed in on that plant because it was a weak plant. Finally, storm systems actually do move organisms. Fall armyworms are called that because they typically are found more abundantly in the fall and summer, late summer and early fall up here. And that's because they rely on atmospheric movement to disperse them. And so they're not actively doing this, but when they're flying around and a big storm event comes, they're going to breed. They breed in the southern states, like Florida and some of the Gulf states, and that's where they can exist all year round. But here they can't overwinter. So every time you see them, it's a new population from the south. And whether they get up here or how quickly they get up here is often dependent on the weather. And storm systems will blow mass amounts of these moths up toward the north, and that's when we get them. So last year we had a lot of fall armyworms attacking lawns and whatnot. There was a lot of calls about it. That was because there were several big storm events earlier in the year that started to move those moths up the coast. And there are other organisms that do this too, and we'll hear more about that in a little bit. All right, finally, cold weather as far as arthropods. Now, I discussed the fall cooling and the kind of movement and hibernation and whatnot, but one thing I want to mention, and Mike is going to mention this a little bit more, is freeze damage. So this is basically the same slide. So flooding the roots of plants will cause them to be more susceptible to ambrosia beetle attack or more attractive to ambrosia beetles, but also freeze damage. So, plants have to naturally, woody plants have to naturally and physiologically get prepared for cold weather. They go into dormancy and then they come out of dormancy. But sometimes improper dormancy or a cold snap or something else can cause freeze damage to occur. And this may not be noticed at first, but you may see these ambrosia beetles attacking a plant and say, I don't know why this is happening. That could be a primary cause of this issue is freeze damage. And I think with that, Mike, how are you doing?
Hi, Matt.
Hey,
Can everybody see and hear me now?
and let me stop sharing real quick. Are you all ready to present, Mike?
I can present at your convenience.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to look in the questions, look in the chat, and see what we have. But I'll answer some questions in the chat while Mike is speaking. So,
All right. And let me apologize in advance if you hear some strange noises in the background from time to time. We are still getting our new space set up here in the clinic, and I am broadcasting from the actual main lab. There's an autoclave, a sterilizer here that makes some strange oh, valve, there you go, goes once, valve and gurgling noises and things. So don't be alarmed. All right, let me go ahead. Did you have any chat questions that you were going to answer, Matt, or do you want me to go ahead and share?
I just have a comment. Somebody said in Asheville, it seems like ants of various types have much more of a problem in yards and around homes since the storm. I'm curious about that. It could be that there's more environment, more since ants often nest in the soil, but also in the trees as well. It may be that the conditions of the soil changed after the storms and the flooding. It also could be that they were displaced and then are kind of have moved, settled into new areas. But that's an interesting observation. I'm not exactly sure why, what would be causing that. And what about abundance of millipedes in the home? So yeah, the millipedes are definitely a group that we associate with heavy rains causing them to leave the sites. They crawl up buildings, crawl into homes, and so that's typically I think of now. Millipedes are active anyway during the year, so if you have an area that is conducive to having millipedes outdoors, you may get some indoors anyway accidentally. But I would say the most often we see them avoiding flooding and moving into homes or up homes or crawling onto to objects nearby.
There were also a couple of comments about ticks being more abundant, and I've noticed that as well.
Yeah, there have definitely been some things more abundant this year than others. I think it could be, it seemed to be fairly, let's say, normal or typical year for maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where we had a nice winter with some snow, it was cold, and a slow spring. I don't know all the details about what affects these different things, but winter survival or winter death of certain things that would kill other organisms, these are all things that interplay into whether things are going to be more abundant or not. So, or mistiming, say something emerges and its parasitoid or its predator doesn't emerge in time because they're a little bit physiologically misaligned, you may not get them being attacked as much, and then you have more of an abundance of them. Oh, and finally, before you start, Mike, there was a question about carpenter ants. They can be after water, but they're very abundant out in the environment. They do destroy wood when there's rot, and actually, that could be weather related. If you have a leak in your home and you have water like storm water coming in. In fact, I had this at my home when we first moved in. The water will invade the wood. It will start to rot it, and basically, that'll make it allow the carpenter ants, black carpenter ants specifically, to be able to excavate the softwood and make their nests. So, all right. Well, I'm going to stop now and stop my part and answer some questions by typing in the chat. But I'll let Mike go with his section.
All right, thank you, Matt. So can everybody see this first slide?
Yes.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And I'm going to continue the presentation talking about some weather-related effects on plant diseases. And I want to start with what we usually use as the baseline for discussing how plant disease develops, which is our disease triangle, which you can find in your Master Gardener handbook if you want to go back and review that. But basically it says that you only get disease if you have a combination of all three factors present at the same time. You've got a susceptible host, a competent pathogen, and the favorable environment in order for those two to interact. I have started saying this as, and you may have heard me you need three to tango, because if you don't have the music, the two dancers are just going to stand there. And that's also true with plant disease. You have to have that environment favorable for disease in order for it to develop. But today we're going to look at a little bit more in depth about the way that environment and way that weather interplays with our plant diseases and disorders. And I've roughly categorized this into 6 different areas, although they're not that cleanly separated. Sometimes it would be hard to say which one is operating, or if it's operating alone or in combination with the others. But they are briefly seasonal pathogen activity. So some of the things like Matt talked about, where we have some times of the year that certain diseases are active and or pathogens are active, and sometimes when others. Also, a concept called predisposition, which I'll go into a little bit on another slide. Then there's direct damage, where the weather is impacting our plants in a direct way. There's the favoring of infection, where weather conditions are making it possible for pathogens to infect plants. And they also have a role in making the symptoms appear or making the symptoms worse. And finally, as Matt mentioned at the end of his presentation, the weather has a role in the dissemination of plant pathogens, or moving them from one location to another. And there are many examples that could be given for any of these 6 concepts, but I'll just highlight a few for each. We, as Matt mentioned, do our BOLOs at the end of each plant pest and pathogen session, and we're focusing on things that you could expect at a certain time of year, and that's because some things are in fact seasonal. So there are pathogens that are warm weather pathogens. We would not expect to see things like southern stem blight caused by, well, it was Sclerotium rolfsii, now the current name is Agroethelia rolfsii. We would not expect to see southern bacterial wilt before, something like mid-May in our area. Whereas the white mold or Sclerotinia blight is something that we would see in the fall and winter months into the early spring. So there's definitely temperature and season effects on how the fungus, how the bacterium is going to be developing. But let's look at this example here. I've said many times that brown patch is a warm season disease of cool season turf. But it's not as simple as just saying that the fungus, the Rhizoctonia in this case, is active in warm weather. It's also the fact that the cool season turf, such as tall fescue here, is stressed by the hot, dry conditions of the season. So you've got this element of predisposition. And the definition of that from the APS Illustrated Glossary of Plant Pathology, available online, is to make prone to infection and disease. So, for example, short and long-term stresses, such as drought, can weaken plant defenses. And it's been known for over a century that armillaria is plants, trees are predisposed to infection by armillaria when drought occurs. So you can have a series of drought years, and then years later still be seeing the increased effects of, or the increased incidence of, armillaria root disease. And that's illustrated here in this photograph. Excuse me. Other factors can also predispose trees to armillaria, such as defoliation, be it from frost, be it from insects, whatever. So there are multiple things, but the idea is that these stressors will weaken the plant's defenses. Perhaps they're affecting the reserve, the storage energy reserves of the tree, and you can get then the weakened defenses. Another example that I know a little bit less about, but when I first started in this job, it was explained to me by Dr. Mike Benson that Volutella blight is something that you see on boxwoods that are under stress. So for example, from drought or inadequate watering, let's say in the nursery. So these are a few examples. The first one, clearly a case of predisposition, where something that the plant experience affects its susceptibility later. So you could have armillaria actually colonizing the soil, actually even on the surface of the roots, but not causing any disease. And you get stress and you get disease. Well, of course, this gets complicated because the species of armillaria that may be involved and so on, but just as a broad brush. We could also talk about the direct damage of our weather events on plant aesthetics and productivity. So on the left here, this is hydrangea, which hydrangea does not like hot sun late in the day. And so you can get these large blotches here of sun scald, not to be confused with the Cercospora leaf spot, the smaller spots there with the light centers. On the other extreme, you can get things like freeze injury. So these camellia blossoms that were affected by a February snow freeze event several years ago. These also can become favor infection in at later stages too. For example, an ice storm where you get a lot of branches breaking on trees and exposing the wood to possible infection by wood decay fungi. Another example of favoring infection is that many of our fungi and all of our bacteria are going to be favored by actual water, free water on plant surfaces. So spot anthracnose of dogwood is going to be variable, the amount that we'll see from year to year. And one of the factors there is how wet the spring is. So we may have a light year, as pictured on the right here, or we may have a hard time finding the disease at all versus a heavy year when you've got bracts that are heavily infected and distorted. There are other diseases as well that are going to be driven by the amount of moisture that's occurring in the spring when the leaves or flowers are developing. Here's a really interesting case where, and we don't see this really in the home landscape, but in the nursery, you can get infection by a bacterium, Pseudomonas syringae, causing cankers on roses. And this follows freeze injury is one of the predisposing or favoring infection, the factors favoring infection. And it works both ways because the bacterium actually has proteins on its surface that promote frost. So they are ice nucleation sites. So the bacterium in a way is somehow facilitating the formation of frost, therefore the freeze injury that benefits the bacterial infection. Kind of a cool system there. Another interesting example from the world of turf would be to show what happens with the weather and its effect in symptom production or symptom expression, or I'm calling it here exacerbating symptoms. So spring dead spot is a disease of our warm season turf species, and the underlying cause is an infection by a fungus in the fall. But the spots show up when? In the spring, because the infected areas are more susceptible to cold injury. So here you have another case where the pathogen is producing a increased susceptibility in the host to a weather factor. One of the strangest things I remember learning when I first started in the clinic back in the late 90s was seeing Tom Cresswell diagnose cold injury in the middle of the summer. And he had to explain to me that what was happening was that the damage that occurred, let's say in the lower portion of the main stems, which is the last part of the plant to go dormant in the fall and the first part to resume activity in the spring, well, that tissue can be damaged by freezes, an early fall freeze, a late spring freeze. And then the water conducting ability of the plant is impaired, resulting in symptoms when there's stress. So the summer comes along and that's when the plant isn't able to supply enough water to its foliage and you get the symptoms that turned out to be the result of cold injury. So here's sort of a delayed effect and a 1-2 punch of the cold, later the hot, dry weather. Another interesting example is Bisconotia canker on oak. So in this case, the fungus exists, and we can discuss terms perhaps of whether we would call it an endophyte or not, but we'll say an endophyte that infected the sapwood of the tree through cracks, for example, in the bark, and basically colonized without causing any apparent damage until the tree is under drought stress. And then you get the fungus forming these stromata where the spores are produced under the bark and pushing the bark off. So here's an example of infection already having taken place, but symptoms occurring when there is stress. And it's sort of a combination of these ideas. Here was a graphic, this is from over a decade ago now, but you can see how in 2013 there was an above normal amount of rainfall in the May through August period of time, but then September turned off really dry that year in comparison to the average. And that would be a perfect setup for things like Phytophthora root rot, where the fungus, well, the fungus-like organism, the oomycete, being a water mold, is really favored by the wet conditions, and the root disease would be occurring there earlier in the year. Once the water becomes in short supply, then you would expect to see the plant showing symptoms because of the compromised root system. So there's an example of both favoring infection in the wet part of the year and then the favoring of symptoms in the dry part of the year. And finally, to give a couple examples like Matt did of the dissemination of pathogens, how they get moved around. That's on the left, that's not a pathogen, that's a wind vane. I don't remember where that picture came from, but wind being a big one. And my example is always the downy mildew of cucurbits, which is unable to survive the winters here in North Carolina, but it will move up each year from the south on the winds. There's another interesting example from Florida, not a North Carolina disease, but citrus canker, a bacterial disease that hurricanes are something you worry about there of moving that one around, just splashing the bacteria, and then driving rains, moving the Xanthomonas around. So that's just a quick step through some of the ways in which there's an interplay between weather and our plant diseases and disorders. So I will stop sharing and take a peek at the chat.
And Mike, do you want me to do some bolos now? And do you have bolos to give? Or
I have bolos to give, but yeah, let's keep it lively here and go back to you, and then
okay,
I'll finish off with some bolos.
great. Okay.
And it looks like we're really good on time today. So
Great, perfect. Okay, let me share some arthropod bolos. So some bolos for late June, early July. And again, like I said, bolos are a generalization, and every year is a little bit different. And in fact, I would say I'm a little bit off on my first one. And this is typically the time of year where I'd say, oh, cicadas are going to start to come out. But we've actually had cicadas emerging and singing for the last few weeks. In fact, Colby in Nashville sent me a photo of a cicada emerging just at the beginning of June, I think, or whatnot, and it was pretty early for me that I had known. But we can't exactly predict. But cicadas you're going to start to see, and with them, and I saw the other day, cicada killers. So the cicada killer wasps are going to come out, and these hunt the cicadas. The cicadas are just up in the trees feeding. The cicadas I'm talking about too are the annual cicadas, not the periodical cicadas that people up in the mountains saw this year. But the cicada killers are hunting the main cicadas, and maybe I don't know how often they hunt the periodical cicadas, but they're going to be hunting the annual cicadas and burying them in the ground. So even though these wasps are large and fearsome looking, they are very docile and are harmless to humans. Okay, you're going to start to see more bigger bugs. The bugs are going to start to grow up now. They're full size. So things like wheel bugs, these very large assassin bugs, Definitely don't want to hold them because they can give a painful jab with their mouth parts. But you'll start to notice some of the bigger bugs out there and about. Fall webworms, not just fall armyworms, which will be a little later in the season, but the webworms are the ones that create these tents up in the tips of branches. They're going to be somewhat small-ish, but I'm sure they're getting bigger in parts of the state now. And over the summer, you're going to see more and more of these webworms, these caterpillars that create these very large silken tents. There's going to be lots more garden caterpillars, of course, so check your plants. There's a lot of activity. You're going to start to see all different things on all different plants, cabbage worms, squash vine borers, but also hornworms, armyworms, all that's fun stuff. Now, as their name implies, June beetles are going to be coming out soon, even though June is almost over. But I have not seen any yet, but they start to emerge kind of early to midsummer. These very large green and bronze beetles will fly quickly over kind of fields where they mate and lay their eggs. They may attack soft fruits, overripe fruits. They can sometimes attack like figs. Sometimes they're called fig beetles or fig-eating beetles. But other soft fruits, they may kind of break open and feed on the sugary juices. And so netting can help, but be on the lookout for these large kind of wasp-like beetles. They fly around very, very much like big wasps. And of course, many critters are getting bigger. So you're going to maybe start seeing some of the larger orb weaver spiders as the year starts to go on. A colleague of mine showed me a photo of one of the teenager ones that they took a few weeks ago, but soon enough, we're going to start to see larger critters out and about as you're outside being more active, depending on how hot it is over the summer. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to Mike.
All right, let me get fired up. Let's see, see, there's a question there,
Okay,
Matt.
yeah. So somebody saw a June bug earlier this morning in Orange County. Very cool. Okay, yeah, and even regionally, even microclimates and different parts of different the state will get those temperatures and the cues. The insects will get those cues differently in different parts of the state. So very cool. Huge wolf spider. Love wolf spiders. So great. And then with all the cicada damage we're seeing, is there anything that we should be on the lookout for, something that takes advantage of the damaged wood? Ooh, that's a very good question for Mike for pathogens. I would say in and of themselves, they are not, if you have a mature, healthy tree, typically there might be some limb damage or some small twig damage. Usually it's small diameter twigs that the cicadas lay their eggs in. And you may get the flagging of those branches. They may break off, but the trees themselves should not be harmed over the long run. So it's not a huge issue for them. Love the writing spider. Yep, that's a type of orb weaver. It makes the designs that black and yellow argiope oftentimes are called writing spiders because they do make these really beautiful silk designs in them. Okay. All right. Well, I'll let Mike do his bolos and then, yeah.
Very well. So what kind of things can we expect to see in North Carolina in late June into July on our landscape and garden plants? Well, the heat of the summer is going to be prime time for slime flux on our hardwoods, especially on white oak, where it tends to be fairly close to the ground. You may catch it in this mode here, where you actually see the active frothing or oozing from cracks in the bark or damage to the bark. This, though, is the result of an interior condition called wetwood, and it will attract a lot of insects. It's fermented sap, and you'll see butterflies, you'll see wasps, you'll see beetles, you'll see flies, all that kind of thing congregating here. It looks alarming, but it's actually not a serious condition. There doesn't mean your tree doesn't have other problems, perhaps, but this could occur one year and then not another. So the amount of fluxing that you'll get will vary from year to year, but it's not something to become immediately alarmed about. We will be seeing, of course, being summer, a lot of powdery mildew. Some of the important hosts of that are crepe myrtles, dogwoods, euonymus, leucothoe, where you can get the red spots on the leaves. You may see it also on rose and spirea. And many trees and shrubs, of course, any time of the year will be suffering the effects of having been planted poorly, too deeply, or too shallow, from being root bound back in the nursery, from girdling roots and so forth. So always keep those kind of human factors in mind when you're diagnosing tree problems. Bacterial leaf scorch is something we'll start to see now. We should get our first cases coming in sometime in July. Red oaks, sycamores, redbuds, and now as of the last few years, we know to be on the lookout for it on our elm trees, as you see in the far right-hand photograph here from campus, and some fairly typical xylella or bacterial leaf scorch symptoms on the leaves. The elms seem to be hit pretty hard by it though. So this seems, I don't know why it took so long to show up on elms here, because we've had the pathogen for a long time, but it could be a pretty serious factor in our elms. Keep on the lookout. In the vegetable garden, a lot going on, of course. Many species susceptible to root knot nematodes, to southern stem blight. Tomatoes, I'll show another slide about those, but our nutritional problems such as magnesium deficiency, that interveinal yellowing or chlorosis in the lower leaves, blossom end rot, and several different kinds of leaf spots, bacteria, septoria, which is a fungus, and tomato spotted wilt virus, and different wilts, so from root knot nematode, southern bacterial wilt, and southern blight. In cucurbits, that slide, that's an old comment there. Disregard the arrival on the 15th of June of 2021. So, but downy mildew on cucurbits, something to be on the lookout for. Powdery mildew, and especially on the squashes, including the pumpkins, anthracnose, and gummy stem blight, especially on watermelon. Here are a few better pictures, bigger pictures of the things to be on the lookout for on tomato. So septoria leaf spot, especially on the lower leaves, and then moving its way up, versus tomato spotted wilt virus, which early on you'll see it on the young leaves, the spotting and other line patterns. And it can cause some pretty interesting symptoms on the fruit as well. And then one of the things, anytime you see a tomato plant wilting, one of the things to consider would be southern bacterial wilt, but that is of course not the only possibility. In the fruits, brown rot and scab on peaches. So the brown rot as the fruit is developing, the picture here on the left, and as well as not only the symptom, but the sporulation of the fungus here visible. And these can reduce a fruit to just a mummy. On apple, we've got cedar apple rust on leaves, frog-eyed leaf spot as well. And on the fruits, you may see black rot, bitter rot, and of course your sooty blotch and fly speck complex in the superficially on the fruit. Cane blight in blackberry, bunch grapes, be on the lookout for black rot on the fruit, also downy mildew, which that's the photo here on the far right. And on muscadine grapes, the leaf spot phase of black rot would be something that you may be seeing in the next month. Here's a picture of cedar apple rust on apple or crab apple. And if you look at it up close on the underside, you'd be seeing these sort of the EC of the fungus where the spores are produced that, if they're lucky, blow on the winds and find a juniper, a cedar tree to infect and continue the life cycle. In the turfgrass area, brown patch, which I mentioned in the main presentation, on our fescue, on our ryegrass, fairy ring, any turfgrass, any time of year you could be seeing. Gray leaf spot on fescue and St. Augustine grass. Pythium blight is another possibility, as well as summer patch, and not a disease, but chinch bugs on St. Augustine grass would be something else to be on the lookout for. And as always, if you want or need, for some reason, more BOLOs, please go to our website, and the menu on the the left has an item called BOLOs that will give you a month-by-month breakdown. So take a quick peek at the chat here.
Looks like we have a question for Matt about mole cricket.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not an expert on control, so I would definitely look at our fact sheet for mole crickets, and we would then consult with Dr. Terry Billison, who's our turf grass entomologist. So I would say if you are having issues with them, submit a sample, an image sample to the clinic, or you can even just email Dr. Terry Billison, and I'll put her contact right here or her name in here for that. So.
Well, I guess, are we ready to move on to plant these for pollinators? I think so. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, excellent. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to give a quick welcome to Allison Whitaker, who's joining us today. Allison is a extension associate with the North Carolina State Climate Office. So glad you could be with us, Allison. And if there are any resources, the State Climate Office has related to the topics we've been talking about today and North Carolina's weather and how we can understand what's happening, just feel free to drop those in the chat. And we will be sure to pick them up and add them to our resource document that we always send out and post following our webinars like Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. And those are posted on the NC Extension Master Gardener intranet, as well as available in the email we send out as a follow-up. All right, so plant these for pollinators. This is a new segment that we introduced this season, and the whole focus of Plant These for Pollinators is to identify plants that are adaptable in landscapes throughout North Carolina and commercially available that you can use in your landscape to provide habitat for pollinators. The slides for these plants are added to a slide set that's available to Master Gardener volunteers and agents to use for programming. So the link on the slide here and the QR code will take you to that slide set. And you are welcome to use these to promote pollinator plants in your community. And our feature plant for June is coneflower. And particularly because coneflower is a common name and can refer to a couple of different genera, we are looking at Echinacea, both the species and cultivars of Echinacea. So there are actually 11 species and botanical varieties that are native to the southeastern United States. And of those, 4 actually occur in North Carolina, but they're fairly rare, so it's not something we see a lot growing in the wild around North Carolina. They have pretty specific habitat areas and counties where they occur. They're all herbaceous perennials. And of all the species, Echinacea purpurea, which was what we see in the picture, its hybrids and cultivars are the most popular and what you typically find at most garden centers. For all of our Echinacea, the flowers are very attractive to pollinators. In addition to providing nectar and pollen for pollinators, the stems have also been found to be used for nesting habitat for our bees. Some of our bees do use plant stems to create their nests where they lay their eggs and where their young develop. So leaving the flowering stems standing in your landscape can provide that additional habitat for pollinators. I should mention too that they were identified as part of a study that Master Gardener volunteers participated in across North Carolina. And we will be sure to link extension publication in our follow-up resource document that has those findings. So one of the reasons Echinacea is so attractive to pollinators is because it has a lot of resources there. There's a lot of pollen and nectar. And when we typically look at a coneflower, it's very easy to think there's one flower. But they are actually composite flowers. And this is true for plants that are in the aster family. So what is actually looks to us possibly as just one flower is many flowers clustered together. And so we have the petals, which are around the bottom. Those are the ray florets. They don't really provide anything, the petals, as far as nectar or pollen, but they do guide the insects to the flower. And then in the center, in the cone part, we have all of these disflorets. So each one of those little, what looks like almost like a spike in the cone, is an individual flower and has its own little pot of nectar, its own pollen. And that's why you will often, if you sit and watch coneflowers and you watch insects on them, you'll see them. They stay there quite some time and they move, they'll just move incrementally over and over and over that flower. And they're going to each one of these ray florets and collecting nectar from each one of those little pots there. As I mentioned, the purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea, is by far the most common coneflower we see in gardens and is available in garden centers. Its native range is a lot of the eastern United States, and it does occur naturally in western North Carolina, but it grows very well throughout North Carolina. The species itself has that pinkish purple flower that bloom from early to midsummer. They're blooming right now, probably across most of North Carolina, but I can definitely say here in central North Carolina, there are many cultivars and hybrids available. And so with the different cultivars and hybrids, you get a kind of an expansion on that color range, and you see many different shades of pink. There's white flowers, there's orange, and kind of mango, and kind of those orange pink shades, and more different colors out there. There are also varieties that have double flowers in addition to the single flower, which is what the regular species has. And with the cultivars and the species, they typically will grow between 2 and 4 feet tall, and between 1 to 3 feet wide. So there's some shorter ones out there and some taller ones, but that's a fairly typical range. They all grow best or flower best in full sun. I have actually had them grow and bloom in, say, maybe 4 to 6 hours of sun a day, but they tend to kind of want to lean out to the sun, just kind of, they're really seeking that sun. So you're going to get the sturdiest plants and the best flowering with that 8 hours plus of sun a day. And of course, like most plants, they're going to be happiest in soil that is both well drained and moist, although they do have really good drought tolerance once they're established. The picture here is one of the cultivated varieties named Glowing Dream, which you can see has a kind of a brighter pink than the typical species. I did want to share just a few pictures of some of the other species of Echinacea you may occasionally run into, especially if you're seeking out the more unusual types. These are native to the eastern United States. The first and last one, Echinacea laevigata, the smooth coneflower, does occur in North Carolina. There's a population in Durham County, I believe Durham and Alamance County. And then the middle one, Echinacea tennesseeensis, is a very rare species that occurs only in a small area of Tennessee. But the pale purple coneflower, Echinacea pallida, also is one that occurs in really limited areas in North Carolina. So you can see these have much narrower petals, especially with laevigata, they droop. So they're really charming in their own way, but they're, compared to the larger, showier flowers of Echinacea purpurea, you can maybe see why these aren't as available commercially, although I would certainly encourage you to seek them out and add them to your landscape. I wanted to mention specifically or talk a little bit about varieties of coneflower, echinacea, that are best for pollinators. And all of this information I'm going to share is based on the Mount Cuba Center's trial of echinacea. So if you're not familiar with the Mount Cuba Center, they're based in Delaware, and they are dedicated to promoting and studying the native flora of kind of the mid-Atlantic region, and they do a lot of studies where they will get every species of a certain genera and many different varieties, and they'll trial them over 3 years, and they'll rate them and they'll observe them, and then they'll put out these wonderful reports that let you know kind of which performed the best. Of course, Delaware's climate is not that different from ours, so I tend to find that what they find does well there does well here as well. And more recently, they've been adding to their trials observations of pollinator activity. So that's the case with their echinacea trial, which took place, I believe, 2018 or 2019 through 2021, that type of time frame. And they looked at quite a few different varieties. I can't remember the total number, but what they found is the top 15 top rated for pollinator activity had either pink or purple flowers. Now, a caveat to that is the picture here, which is a variety named Fragrant Angel. And that was actually the species they found to have the most visitations by pollinators. And one thing that was kind of interesting about it is with most of the echinacea varieties in their trial, 95% of the pollinators that were visiting were bees and wasps, and only 5% were butterflies. But Fragrant Angel particularly attracted more species of butterflies, especially red admirals and monarchs. And that kind of is what tipped it over to having the most visitations. Actually, behind this cultivar Fragrant Angel, it was just the straight species Echinacea purpurea that had the most visitations. So absolutely, that is still a great just species to grow in your garden. You don't necessarily have to seek out any of these name varieties. They also noted that many goldfinches visited the plants in late summer and early fall. They weren't particularly counting that, but it was just something that if you have echinaceas in your garden, you've probably noticed that as well. So it's good to leave the seed heads after the flowers fade. So that's a resource also for goldfinches. And I see there was a question related about that, is when to stop deadheading to provide for critters in the fall. So deadheading, is something you can do to extend the flowering time, but I would only deadhead those earliest flowers so that you will definitely get some later flowers. And then I would leave those later season flowers just to mature into those seed heads. So those resources are available. So here's a look. This is just a screen, shot I took out of the report, the Mount Cuba report on echinacea for the Mid-Atlantic region. And, I know you're not going to be able to read these individual varieties, but you can go to the report and explore those. But you can see some varieties had much higher levels of visitation than others. And when we get here to the bottom end where there's very low visitation, some of them only 2 or 3 pollinators, and this was the average that they observed. They observed these plants when they're in flower every day for a specific amount of time and just counted how many different pollinators visited. The specific details of how the trial was held are also included in the report. But the one thing that really stands out here is the double flowered varieties are shaded in this kind of reddish brown, and they are all down here at the lowest. Absolute lowest number of visitations. So a huge takeaway here is our single flowered varieties are best for pollinators. And that really makes sense when you look at these double flowers, because what has happened in those is the florets that were in the center that provided all the nectar and pollen have turned into petals. So there's really very little resources here for a pollinator. This is a double variety named Hot Papaya. So encourage, anytime you're promoting planting echinacea for pollinators, to use those single varieties and kind of limit use of these double varieties just to botanical curiosities almost. I won't share my comments necessarily on my observations of the appearance of the double varieties. I know some people like them, but the single varieties are going to be a lot more have a lot more resources for pollinators, and then as well for the birds, because these double varieties aren't going to set seed either. don't want to step on Matt and Mike's toes, but I did want to throw it a little, be on the lookout for echinacea because I've seen both of these in my garden. And for years, I did not realize they were different things until Matt highlighted this irified mite damage in Plants, Pests, and Pathogens a few years ago. So many of you have probably heard of aster yellows, which is here on the right side of the slide. And that is phytoplasma, which is a little bit like a virus, but it is a different type of disease. It is spread by leafhoppers. And many plants in the aster family will get it. We can definitely see it on echinacea, and it causes the plant to just do really weird things. You can see the flowers don't develop normally. They just look really strange. The plants look unhealthy and usually stunted. And the only thing you can do with aster yellows is remove the plant. There's no way to treat that. It's systemic throughout the plant and it won't recover. But then you may also see just in the cone part of the echinacea flower, this kind of little green sprouting or rosetting, and the rest of the plant looks fine. And I was seeing that on some plants in my yard and thinking it was early symptoms of aster yellows and pulling them out. But fortunately, I then learned from Matt that this is just the symptoms of a specific type of irified mite, which feeds on the flowers, and it's not any type of lasting damage. It's kind of curious looking. I just leave it actually when I have it, but if it's bothers you, you could deadhead those flowers to remove the mites. I didn't know, Matt, if you wanted to throw anything in on that.
Yeah, they are. It's kind of sporadic. It's fairly common, but year to year it'll vary, and the mites kind of travel down to the base of the plant when it starts to get cold. So yeah, removing some of those heads might help, but it's not going to kill the plants, and they're kind of sporadically here or there. You may see more this year than less next year. And one of the really interesting things about this mite is that it has a common name, the coneflower rosette gall mite, but it has never been formally described, which is crazy. And we were working on a project to do that, but they never described the species, so we don't have a species name for it really, which is funny, but a common name. And yeah, it's we also think that it may travel, with bees, like hitch rides on bees, because they're very tiny mites, about a quarter of a millimeter long. And so you wouldn't really notice them unless they're looking really closely and cutting them open and looking under the scope. But yeah, those very thick spikes, those green spikes in the middle of the head with a normal looking flower, otherwise, is how you distinguish it from the aster yellows, which creates mostly green foliage like symptoms. And so, but yeah, it's not a huge issue. Don't be super concerned or freak out if you see them. You can remove some of those heads and remove some of the population.
All right, thank you.
And if
you
I may
can,
chime in,
oh, absolutely.
yes,
Please, Mike.
aster yellow, it is, you could say it's, well, the pathogen is actually the phytoplasma, which is a type of bacterium. So it's not a virus, but it has that in common with the viruses that it is transmitted by an insect, in this case, a leafhopper. And there are different subgroups within the aster yellows phytoplasmas, and I'm not sure which one or ones get on the echinacea. But I also wanted to ask something, Charlotte, or make a comment. So I have heard that the genetics are unstable in some of these echinaceas, and I think I've seen that myself in our garden, where one of the colored petaled varieties kind of reverts, or part of the plant reverts to the wild type. Have you seen that yourself?
I have. So, a lot of these cultivars, and some of them are hybrids, they will self-seed. And especially if you have areas where the mulch is a little thin, or I get the seedlings a lot kind of at the edge of the bed, and maybe where the mulch is thin, or where it kind of edges on gravel. And the seedlings almost always tend to kind of revert back to that more wild type with the pinky purple flower and maybe a little taller if it was a shorter variety. So yeah, so they will self-seed if you let them, and the seedlings do tend to go back to the wilder type of species look.
Which is a pretty plant in itself. I'm not knocking that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, as we saw, had the second highest pollinator visit. So it's a great one. Just the species itself is wonderful for pollinators and a beautiful plant. All right, thank you both for weighing in on that. And you can investigate and learn more about these echinaceas on the Plant Toolbox. There are several species covered there and several of the varieties that are available. So we encourage you to check that out. I did see a question, I thought. Yeah, I saw a comment about the Echinacea tennesseeensis. That it is endangered, and that may be because it cross-pollinates a lot. So yeah, Echinacea tennesseeensis is endangered in its natural habitat in Tennessee, which is a very isolated area. So you actually, what you find available if is Echinacea tennesseeensis is typically a hybrid. And they do, all of the echinaceas will cross-pollinate, and some of that is because the bees are so prolific on them. So when we're growing Echinacea tennesseeensis hybrids in our gardens here in North Carolina, we're not endangering the natural habitat, which is an isolated area of Tennessee. But say if, for example, you did live near that isolated area of Tennessee where this occurs, you may want to, like within a mile or two, because thinking about how bees move, you would not want to be growing these other echinaceas, particularly close to that natural habitat for the plant. But for us here in North Carolina, we're far away. And even though honeybees will travel 5 or 6 miles, they're not going to travel that far to cross-pollinate them. So preserving that species as a wild species and its natural habitat is really important. But it would be in that area around the natural habitat that you would be most concerned about that cross-pollination occurring. And let's see. Had a question about deadheading echinacea to get seeds for planting. So if, in my experience, if I just let the seeds stay on them and they let it disintegrate, they self-seed on their own quite prolifically. But if you want to collect those seeds to grow more plants, just make sure they're fully mature so that they've dried out, they're brown. I do see a lot of times when people are collecting seed or they want to collect seed, they will collect them too early. And so you want to make sure that that seed head has had time to mature. It's fully, usually most seed heads will turn brown and they'll be all dried out by the time they start to mature. Some of them may even just start to disintegrate a little bit. If they're already starting to disintegrate where the seeds are falling off the cone, they're ready. So just give them time. So usually you would be looking later in the fall to do that. Okay. So we will finish up today with some announcements. And also just want to mention these announcement slides are available to you. So if you see a slide in here that you would like to use for a local program, either for Master Gardener volunteers or a public program, because some of these are also applicable to the public, please download these slides and use them. We want to make it easy for you to share the information and announcements. And first up, we hope everybody has August 22nd and 23rd marked on their calendar for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census. This is a citizen science project where anybody, any age, can go out, and it only takes 15 minutes to observe pollinator activity on a plant in your landscape or any public space. It doesn't have to be in your yard. And then you upload those results to the Great Southeast Pollinator Census website, and it makes them available for researchers to use in pollinator conservation and pollinator monitoring. It is also a wonderful opportunity just to increase awareness of the importance of pollinators and educate people on how to create pollinator habitat so that we can help pollinators thrive. In North Carolina, Amanda Wilkerson, Amanda Bratcher, who is the extension agent in Lee County, is our state coordinator for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census in North Carolina. She is planning 2 webinars that are open to everybody. So Master Gardener volunteers, extension professionals, the general public. One will be on July 10th, and that one is going to focus on insect ID tips. So that one is really going to prepare you to go out and observe and identify those pollinators. And then on August 15th, closer to the census itself, is going to be more of what kind of research and what great things are going on around pollinators in North Carolina and the Southeast. So we encourage you to put those on your calendar, and as soon as the links are available for them, we'll get them on the Extension Master Gardener Internet calendar as well. But those are open to the public. And then if you haven't visited the website for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census in North Carolina, the QR code here will take you there. And we'll also certainly include that link in our resource document. There's some great resources there. You can, if you're going to host a local event, you can register your event there. So that just helps us understand what's going on in North Carolina, across North Carolina for the pollinator census. There are resources and guidance that Amanda has put together, just amazing diversity and amount of resources for different groups who are thinking of hosting events. And there are also marketing materials, including these lovely graphics. That's where I pulled these graphics that are on this slide, and there's a lot more there. So be sure to check it out. Also hope you are holding the date for the International Master Gardener Conference. So this is a conference that's held every other year. This year it's being hosted by the Texas Master Gardener Program, and it's virtual. So you don't have to travel. You can attend just from the comfort of your own home, August 25th through 28th. And not only do you attend during the live sessions, but if you register, will have access to all the recordings through the end of January. So I think that's 5 or 6 months of access. So you don't have to worry if there's 2 things being offered at once, because there's all kinds of amazing sessions lined up. You can choose which one you attend live, and then you can watch the recording for the other one. So registration is open. You can register now online. I believe registration closes at some point in August, but you want to go ahead and register sooner rather than later. We have some upcoming exciting continuing education opportunities. So building a design gallery on the Plant Toolbox will be July 17th. And Scott Zona will be joining us. Of course, he is the Plant Toolbox manager. He also manages the Extension Gardener online learning courses. And he will be telling us all about how your extension demonstration garden can be featured in the design gallery on the Plant Toolbox. So we hope you will join us then, and you can register on the EMG intranet for that and get the Zoom link. If you missed our continuing education webinar just a couple of weeks ago with Remy Ham, who talked about designing youth gardens that spark curiosity, wonder, and imagination, you can view the recording. I strongly recommend that. It was an excellent, very inspiring webinar, not only just for youth gardens, but for gardens that will spark curiosity, wonder, and imagination in people of all ages. So you can check that out. That recording link is also available on the North Carolina Extension Master Gardener intranet under the continuing education page. All right, more opportunities to learn. Good follow-up to today's webinar. The next offering in the garden, lawns, and landscapes online courses. These are the Extension Gardener courses based on the handbook that Scott Zona leads. The next one coming up is Pest and Disease Management. So if you want to build your skills or sharpen your knowledge in that area, that course starts July 1st and runs through August 15th. It is self-paced and totally online and available during those time periods. Coming up later this fall is landscape materials and design, and then the series will finish up with lawn management and weeds, and then most likely start over again next year. So encourage you, if any of those courses sound interesting, to check out the website and register if you're interested in the pest and disease management course. I should mention there is a discount, a $30 discount per course for Master Gardener volunteers. And there are additional discounts for extension professionals. So if you need information about those discounts, you can reach out to Scott, and there's an email address on the site where you can reach out. Your agent will need to reach out to get those codes. Also, the Therapeutic Horticulture online course series, there's a couple of those that are in that series coming up, including the Intro to Therapeutic Horticulture. So that's the first one. And it is a prerequisite for most of the following courses. So if you're interested in starting a learning journey about therapeutic horticulture, that is the place to start. It will begin August 25th. And if you have already started those courses, course number 3 will be offered this fall, accommodating diverse populations, and that will start August 11th. But you can learn more about those courses through this QR code and link. And of course, all of these will be part of our follow-up resources we send out. And if you want to get those follow-up emails, sign up for our NCMGV Google group. So everybody in North Carolina, all of our Master Gardener volunteers get our quarterly newsletter, which just quarterly comes out 4 times a year. So everybody's going to get that automatically. But we do have this separate Google group that we kind of call our breaking news group that you would need to sign up for. This one's optional. We're not going to put anybody on it automatically. But this is where you'll get those more frequent reminders. You know, this webinar is coming up next week or tomorrow. And this is also where we send the follow-up emails to say, if you missed this webinar, here's where the recording is, and here's where the resources are. So this is everything you're going to get here is going to be directly related to your work as a Master Gardener volunteer. So you don't need to worry about getting a bunch of off-topic stuff. It is also a moderated group, so you're not going to get a bunch of extra emails. You know, it's mostly going to be from me and Araya or Scott or Amy, who leads the therapeutic horticulture classes, or Lucy, so from us at the state level. But really encourage you to sign up if you want to get those more frequent reminders. And of course, we will send a follow-up email there to about today's webinar with the recording and the resource document, but you can always find those on the North Carolina Extension Master Gardener intranet under the Plants, Pests, and Pathogens link. So be sure to go there if you're wanting to catch up on recordings from earlier this season or past seasons. They're all available. And we look forward to seeing you next month, July 22nd, when Dr. Lucy Bradley will be joining us to talk about climate resilient strategies for home gardens and landscapes. So a great follow-up to today's topic. And we hope you are all able to join us.